I'm Rick Harsh, and I'm here to review a book about the British and their imperial habits in the past, and actually up to the present, because what this book does is follow the post-imperial tactics of fastening themselves to the anus of the United States. It's called The Blood Never Dried, and if you don't get that right away, it was from, let me read exactly what it was. Ernest Jones, a British socialist, in 1851, repeated the famous line about the sun never setting on the British Empire. He said, "On its colonies, the sun never sets, but the blood never dries." And this is a book about the brutality of the British in their imperial endeavors. And the next book I'm writing is about India. The next novel I'm writing is about India and colonialism. And so I wanted to do a little bit of reading. And this one is not focused on India. It, in fact, ranges from slavery and the Jamaican Rebellion, the Irish Famine, the Opium Wars, the Great Indian Rebellion, the invasion of Egypt, goes into China again, and the Irish again, and India again, Palestine, which is really an important one, I think, and there are some things that I'll be telling you that I don't think you really want to hear, but the Mau Mau Rebellion, Malaya, and the first great loss of the British was to the United States, when the United States says, no, you can't have the Suez Canal back, and it supported Nasser. One of the funny things about this book is that the guy, the author, John Newsinger, has, I think he's probably British himself. He is constantly pointing out that various things are happening under labor governments. And it reminds me a lot of the United States about, how the most imperial oligarchic bunch in the United States are the Republicans, but the Democrats end up somehow starting a lot of the wars. It's always been the case, and the reason for that is very simple. They are imperial. They're imperial countries, and the labor and the liberals, the Democrats in the United States, they support empire completely, but they also try occasionally to do something for the folks at home, like the National Health Service, which in the end lost some money to the military, quite a bit actually, in order to please the U.S. allies by increasing their spending to a greater percentage of their GDP than the U.S. was spending on its. That's certainly no longer true. But I've long been enraged by the fact that the British came out of their imperial adventures having utterly destroyed India, and I've not heard much about reparations because India never recovered. India was one of the great economies of the world when the East India Company first set foot there. And when they left, well, you can imagine what they left with. I have a little bit. I took a few notes, but mostly just to mark passages I want to read from. It's pretty outrageous. There's a little the amount of violence is too little known, and the types of violence. So from the introduction, let me just read a couple of things about what they would do to human beings. Although racism was absolutely necessary for them to do the things that they did, and none were more racist than Winston Churchill. So I don't know if I'll say enough about Winston Churchill, but I've been pondering a question. When you read Indian mythology, most evil people or gods are well-rounded and not nearly as evil as Winston Churchill. And I wonder if the early Hindus, the early Indian thinkers, were even capable of conceiving of true evil. It's just something for me to study. But they're with Churchill, they came up against true evil, and I don't like to use the word evil very often, but when you live in a world in which Henry Kissinger is fated, and it is never imprisoned, yet people like Milosevic and Mladic have to be, you have to consider that some sort of descriptive name is necessary. Evil. Kissinger was one of the most evil people who ever lived, and so was Winston Churchill. Okay, we got beaten and castrated, and then we got Jane Mara. I think we're in Africa right now. Regularly beaten and on one occasion raped with a heated bottle that a guard forced in her vagina with his boot. More rape, okay. Various things were done. 500 examples from Kenya. This included the burning alive of detainees. Here's one victim who was held down flat on his back while a thin-spouted coffee pot poured a trickle of water up his nose while his head was clamped immovably between cushions that left no marks of bruising. Here's a gloating policeman met in Nablus early in his career who produced an old cigarette tin containing the brains of a man whose skull he had splintered with his rifle butt. That's in the introduction. The bombardment of Surabaya, look that one up. I can't go into all of them here. But I have for each chapter, or almost every chapter, something to read. Here's one from the Jamaican Rebellion. Now, we know that the British were ahead of the U.S. in terms of abolishing slavery, but they did they did run slaves, and well, for rebellion, and here we're on Antigua. Slaves were usually punished by nailing them down to the ground and then by applying fire by degrees from the feet and hands, burning them gradually up to the head, whereby their pains are extravagant. For lesser crimes, castration or mutilation, chopping off half the foot, was the norm. And for negligence, none of us like negligence, they were usually whipped. After they are whipped till they are raw, some put on their skins pepper and salt to make them smart. And at other times, their masters will drip melted wax on their skins and use very exquisite torture. Page 25, same chapter. The Jamaican planter Thomas Thistlewood, for example, in 1756, had a slave caught eating sugar cane, well flogged and pickled. I'm not sure what they mean by pickled, but well flogged and pickled, then made Hector shit in his mouth. This excremental punishment was used regularly enough on the estate to become known as Derby's dose. I don't know who Derby was, but so much for the anti-slavery Brits. From Ireland, I have just one quote. The people, he complained, he being I've lost who it was. A major Brit. The people of Ireland, he complained, actually thought that a revolution would lead to a government that feeds the whole nation. Can't have that, can you? So, that's Ireland. Now, we're moving on to the Opium Wars. This is one of the most brilliant money-making schemes of the empire. They grew the opium, of course, in India, and they forced the Chinese to buy it and accept it. And though it was illegal, they forced them to change that law. They got opium, or they got I guess I didn't actually write down anything to read from here. But this is the kind of thing that they would do. There was the Taiping Rebellion is also talked about, and at one point, the British are fighting the Taiping rebels, and the rebels have captured some Brits, or one Brit, one particular, a missionary, Mr. Milne. He fell into Taiping hands as this one-sided slaughter was taking place, the British slaughtering the Taipings. He was given an escort to see him safely to the city gate, whereupon British troops massacred the escort. Very typical of the British, that kind of thing. But the Opium Wars were a lengthy affair, each very one-sided. The second one a little bit more difficult. The Taiping Rebellion was in between, but they forced Indians to grow one crop, opium, and they owned it. They didn't have to buy it, and then they sold it at exorbitant prices in China. They made them buy it. In India, not much is ever really written about the brutality of the British, except for when it really got out of hand, like with the Amritsar massacre. But things like that happened all the time. Not always on that scale and as famously, but Well, they were they were brutal. They were brutal. Um, and let me read here something about the millocracy, the textiles. Um, Once the millocracy had destroyed the Indian textile industry, it discovered that the transformation of India into a reproductive country has become of vital importance. And railways were necessary. That's why they had railways. I hope I'm not taking too many shortcuts. I'm just afraid of going too long. Um, Karl Marx thought that the nature of company rule was best demonstrated by its reliance on torture. So there's an example in here of tying scorpions to the breasts of young women. Egypt, the one of the most bizarre things about Egypt is that they their problem came from building the Suez Canal, which put them deeply in debt. Now, I've never read a lot about that, but and I don't understand money well enough to understand how that's possible. But that was the case, and that's what gave the British Egypt. They were bankrupt, and so guess who stepped in? Now, another figure in this book who appears quite often is Mohandas K Gandhi, and what I wanted to say about Gandhi is that, in my opinion, um, he was overly enamored of the rich. I'm not sure why. I don't understand it. But he called off the movement famously in the early 20s when things were going very well. This book does not discuss the convergent tragedies that hit India in World War I, which were the misnamed Spanish flu and extraordinary famine. Um, they do mention the famine of uh, the Bengal famine in 43 and 44 and 45, I guess. We don't know how many million died, but there was plenty of food. And well, I think I have here something Churchill said. Well, anyway, he just called them beasts. Um, you know, it's he famously referred to Gandhi as a Middle Temple lawyer who went around half naked, a fakir, which is not a Hindu um, thing at all. Um, but I really think that Gandhi um, caused a great deal more harm in India than he did good. Um, he was his principles were at times arbitrary. I used to think that Gandhi was very far-sighted in wanting to retain the village India, but then why the millionaires? And uh, it's hard to imagine that a full-scale rebellion in the early 20s would have failed, and it's hard to imagine that the country would have then um, been divided, and I think it would have saved millions of lives. I think in the end, Gandhi was a bad, historically bad influence on his country. Fun as it is to read about him, um, great as Ben Kingsley looks playing him, uh, Gandhi was baleful influence on them. Now, in Palestine, I have to jump like this. In Palestine, the weird thing is that the Balfour Declaration seemed unnecessary, and I don't know enough about why the British guaranteed Israel Palestine during World War One or right after World War One, unless it was that they felt that by doing that they would keep the French out because they would ally themselves with the Zionists. But one important thing to understand about the situation in Palestine is that without the British, it may never have been possible for the Zionists to win. At a certain point, they realized that the British were only going to hurt them, and so they committed atrocities very similar to the ones that are committed occasionally in Tel Aviv by Palestinians, bombings and such. They quite famously the King David Hotel. They did things like that quite regularly in the late 30s and early 40s. They had terrorist organizations, but the thing that is the most hard to stomach is their collaboration with the Nazi Party. And I'll read to you here, it's not all new information, but it's not something much talked about. One other point worth making here is the extent to which the Zionist movement actually collaborated with the Nazis in the 1930s, in particular with the SS. To be blunt, they found they had a shared interest in the eviction of Jews from Germany. Reinhard Heydrich, no less, later to be the architect of the Holocaust, in September 1935 proclaimed his solidarity with Zionism in the SS newspaper Das Schwarze Korps. The Nazis, he made clear, were in complete agreement with the great spiritual movement within Jewry itself, the so-called Zionism, with its recognition of the solidarity of Jewry throughout the world and the rejection of all assimilationist ideas. Adolf Eichmann, a key figure in the destruction of Europe's Jews, actually visited Palestine in 1937 at the invitation of Zionists. The Gestapo worked closely with Mossad. That's something to memorize. Write that on your bedroom wall. The Gestapo worked closely with Mossad, the Zionist agency handling illegal immigration. In 1939, Heydrich was demanding that Mossad should be sending off 400 Jews per week from Berlin alone. This cooperation extended to the SS providing the Haganah with smuggled arms. That was the military branch. The British. Then we have on page 167, this is a terrible review. This is Churchill. I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. On another occasion, he insisted that they were the beastliest people in the world next to the Germans. Amory was bemused by his curious hatred of India and concluded that he was really not quite normal on the subject. Indeed, Amory was not sure whether on this subject of India he is really quite sane. Evil. He's evil. And anyway, I'm just giving you a few things from this book, none of which should be as surprising as they are. What I will say is that when he talks about starting NATO with the United States and so on, he leaves out a couple of things. And it's a relatively short book. It's not quite 300 pages, and it's just but it's very to the point. It's well written, and there's just no fat on this book. But he still could have mentioned the Chagos Islands. The United States built their base, Diego Garcia, on the British stolen island, which the British cleared for the United States of people. The Chagos Islanders are still suing the British and for the right to return to Diego Garcia, like that's ever going to happen. They ended up in slums in Mauritius. It's one of the ugliest chapters of history. And another thing that happened, which is far too little known, is that when NATO was formed, there was already cooperation between the secret services in England and in the United States, and they ended up forming a very secret group that was a part of NATO. CIA actually was a part. This part of the CIA was independent of the CIA in Washington, was under NATO, and they worked with the British, and they ran secret armies in all of Europe that was not satellites of Russia. They did things like they rejuvenated the Nazis, rehabilitated the Nazis. They helped Nazis like Klaus Barbie escape. They took they were responsible largely for many atrocities during the years of lead in Italy. They supplied the explosives. They helped with planning. They helped with escape routes. Bombers, fascist bombers in Italy often went to Spain, to the Canary Islands. That was one of the favorite spots to, when the trail was hot, they sent them to the Canaries. And they did a lot of really bizarre things, and I guess I'll end with this one. Belgium also had a secret army, although sometimes they were so secret that prime ministers were elected without even knowing that they existed. But one time, and I believe it was in the late 60s, the United States and some Brits, about 10 of them, decided to run a little test. They decided to do a little test run. And they parachuted into Belgium near the Luxembourg border. They got someone from the secret army in Luxembourg to guide them to the munitions depot in Vielsalm, Belgium. And once they had been guided, they sent the Luxembourgish fellow home, who the next day read about an attack on the munitions depot in Vielsalm, in which one soldier was killed and another wounded. So maybe gratuitous, I don't know. But that was another thing that the British helped the United States with. My conclusion is that books like this are extremely important so that people don't forget what happened and why some places are intransigent. Never intransigent enough. I believe that reparations are called for, and that is not the subject of this book, but it has been discussed, and of course it will never happen, but it's very hard to stomach a a Britain that is one of the wealthiest countries in the world despite themselves, and an India that is a disaster when it never had to be. And maybe the Portuguese were the first there, um, and they were brutal, but in the end, it was hundreds of years of the British that really devastated the economy of India. So, The Blood Never Dried, A People's History of the British Empire by John Newsinger, um, highly recommended, unhappily read.